The next presenter is Agnieszka, and from James Cook University in Australia, and she's going to talk to us about migration and the Metoo movement and its presence within the Pacific diaspora. Agnieszka.
Hi, how are you all? So my name is Agnieszka and I come from Poland, and I am very happy and privileged to be here. So thank you so much for having me here. So I come from Poland, and before I got my master's degree from French literature and from British literature and Belgian literature and Polish one. And I got a scholarship at James Cook University to study literature in Oceania. So Women Voice Agency, how do they talk about their feelings and advocacy. And so this presentation is the 7th chapter of my thesis, because the thesis in general is about gendered violence, which affected me personally, my family. So that's why this is a little bit close to me. And I will be looking forward to hear your feedback and your thoughts on it. And maybe it will be easier if I will just play my pre-recorded one, because my English is not always so perfect. Hello, everyone. The presentation Migration and Me Too, Feminist Activism and the Pacific Diaspora is the part of the contemporary and emerging challenges, Me Too, cancel culture, and speaking out about gender violence in the Pacific and Pacific Diaspora, which is the 7th chapter of my PhD thesis, Gendered Violence in the Tropical Pacific, the use of storytelling to reflect social global inequality.
Agnieszka, could you increase just a little bit your sound, because even for us.
Sorry?
Yeah, that's better. The sound is better.
Is that good?
The Me Too movement, resulting from the Alyssa Milano's tweet in October 2017, sparked a worldwide debate on digital storytelling and rape culture. The long history of human rights movements around the world, such as Arab Spring or Black Lives Matter, following the second wave, feminism facilitated the recognition for this new form of activism on social media platforms. Digital footprints of this activism are one way to retrieve individual stories and examine collective feminist memory. Alison Phipps argues that the use of empathy is applied to support and strengthen certain dominant political or economic ideologies. The restraint of empathy in this context is especially harmful to people who are not the escapist or survivors of sex industry, but others who state and their voice agency has a minimal strength to reach masses. She concludes her article saying, the injuries felt by those who are more privileged, while certainly painful, are not commensurate with the experience of oppression. The statement finds its reference to the comparison between the treatment of feminists who fight for their rights. As a result, there is media privilege in mainly white, middle-class, cisgendered, heterosexual, Anglophone women. The studies conducted by Irene Lopez have revealed that the Me Too movement is not only global, but also very regionally specific. In evidence of this, the version of Me Too hashtag differs across the globe, where feminist hashtags have different connotations. The French version, Balance ton port, was proved to be more aggressive and direct in accusation than its American equivalent. In India, Me Too was used often to blame men for the attacks in general and pay more attention to religion and cultural aspects. The processes of cultural exchange are visible in media communication, where, opposed to call-in confrontation, the call-out culture spreads social revolution and encourages the concept's development with proper adjustments to local contexts. The migration of movements on social platforms from the United States to Oceania is seen through lenses of digital activism such as Me Too, which encourage women to regain their voice, agency, in sharing the experience of harassment. In October 2019, Barack Obama criticized activists for call-out culture with words, "That's not activism," and "People who do really good stuff have flaws." People who you are fighting may love their kids and share certain things with you. That's the tool of social activism or condemning individual for lifetime.
The sound is still not very good. Could you increase it on your laptop?
You should get over that. The world is messy. There are ambiguities. People who do really good stuff have flaws. People who you are fighting may love their kids and share certain things.
Digital activism has successfully reached out to Oceania's neighboring areas, such as the Philippines or Maldives, and many other Asian areas where online activism has been supported by offline protests and initiatives. Yet studies have proved that the level of activism engagement relies on internal political structures and government reliability. The Bayesian model analysis of Metoo samples of tweets from July and September 2019, respectively, resulted in a characterization of factors favoring the participation in feminist online protests. The studies proved open political systems to be the most propitious government models, as they provide access to direct democracy, respect of citizens' liberty, and protection of the rights of marginalized groups. Fiji remains one of the regions where women activists are exceptionally vital. Hence, the area has been called Oceania's technological revolution due to the advancement in use of cell phones and social platforms, with over 40% of Fijians being active online. Online posting has gained a lot of attraction because of the government surveillance of the freedom of speech. Moreover, young people find it easier to find space where their voice and opinions could be heard. One of the participants of the research conducted by Tate Brimacom expressed her sense of solidarity and inclusion. My first real experience was in Facebook when I started sharing on my status of things happening to people I know or to me personally. It created this energy around it where people started commenting on it, showing solidarity and being supportive and sharing their own experiences. As a result, Tate Brimacom concludes, in the context of Fiji's political environment and media landscape, social media is a valuable platform for activists to publish and share statements, news, and information which would otherwise have limited opportunities for public consumption. In many cases, violent acts fall outside the ambit of narratable language. Thus, the act of telling one's story can recognize personal or cultural violence, ease the act of forgiveness, soften the pain, and continue to recover. In some cases, some sort of relief can be felt when a victim of a crime hears the confession from the abuser. According to the spiral of silence theory, however, individuals often choose to remain silent due to the threat of isolation, as well as doubting about one's own capacity for judgment. Judith Herman notices that opening plainly in the confession of abuse or assault can often elicit further shame and stigmatization. This is particularly important in broader Asian Pacific. In addition to the routine cases of stories of gender violence being silenced or invisible, many factors often impede social dialogue around gender violence in the South Pacific, including cultural taboos, strict morals, and conservative religious standards,
social ostracism, as well as secrecy and traditional values. The form of feminism present in Oceania would be considered to be different from the Western vision, as the accent will be always placed on gender equity and collectiveness over the individual experience. As Spark points out, women in the South Pacific would see the problem of gender equality not based on the patriarchal tyranny, but rather through prism of problems of colonization and institutionalized racism. In this context, Western feminist is seen as a person who is erasing older forms of women's power that are grounded in collective identities and esteemed roles such as motherhood and connection to. The usage of traditional part of the culture called talanoa is successfully applied in discussing the problems of domestic violence. According to Alliance community in American Samoa, talanoa means telling stories which lead to effective decision strategies in the community, as well as share experiences and individual knowledge. When asked about the goals that she's trying to achieve, Arietta Talanoa, the founder of Talanoa online magazine for Pacific Community and Diaspora, says, to offer all Pacific people an opportunity to tell their story in their own way and with their own voice. I believe that storytelling is key to challenging stereotypes and to showcase the Pacific's diversity. The most important thing in my mind is giving people a chance to feel empowered, to educate one another, and to do so in a new digital space. The diffusion of Metoo through the international social platforms takes place to a certain extent in Pacific Islands communication across the globe and media public discussions. In New Zealand, the journalist Alison Moe, editor of the Metoo NZ project, exposes sex offenders in workspaces. The I Am Someone online campaign gathers hundreds of personal stories of abuse and harassment from women in New Zealand. The initiative continues the achievements of female silence breakers honored in the United States by sharing stories of female survivors of abuse. On blogs which provide anonymity, women often describe sexual assault, often at the hands of a close person of trust. On her website, Lani Wen-Yang, a Samoan writer, wrote a letter to the chairman of the National Council of Churches in response to his victim-blaming statements in an interview by the Samoa Observer. The author described her powerlessness as a 7-year-old victim of rape. Lani Wen-Yang's testimony has been met with many positive responses from women who experience abuse, although the other reaction embodied an outrage of family members. One condemned my disclosure as disgusting and bringing shame on our family. In her blog entry, Fijian writer Tulia Thompson remembers the strict religious upbringing and parental expectations which disenabled her from telling about the abuse. I can remember thinking that Dad wouldn't cope with knowing I wasn't a virgin. She stresses the damaging consequences of physical upbringing methods. I can honestly tell you that corporal punishment I experienced as routine as a kid made violence feel ordinary. The dispersal of the Nietzsche movement in Oceania takes form in different social initiatives outside of the hashtag, such as the Girl Walk, founded by Maluseu Doris Tulifau. These forms of female activism stress the importance of family values and closeness between its members in terms of loyalty. When any of us get molested or raped, we consider our family and the family of the perpetrator and how the whole village will be impacted. She adds to the equation church patriarchal theology and remarks that the diaspora moving across the Pacific Rim perpetuates the harmful culture of violence.
There are 42
million survivors of sexual abuse. Three times the amount of cancer survivors. Yet you never hear the fight to cure this disease.
Where are the bracelets?
Where are the bracelets? Where are the stickers behind the soccer mom bands for this awareness?
Sexual
abuse is a silent epidemic.
Nevertheless, the reality of feminist activism and silence breaking often encounters absence of government encouragement from the highest authorities. The Prime Minister of Samoa, Tuilaepa Malielegaoi, has openly condemned news media for Monday to Sunday over-reporting of sex crimes, including incest, which risk harming the Samoan reputation on the international stage, thereby diminishing the problem. Based on the example of the Samoan Prime Minister, presented closeness of the political structure is opposite to values which encourage freedom of speech and activism. The future of the diaspora and social media on Pacific Islands in the next few decades is being analyzed mainly from the perspective of globalists and Oceanians who underline the role of the South Pacific diaspora in their forecasts. The first pessimistic standpoint, represented by Rowan Kallick, states that in this overpopulated, dependent on capitalistic market and demanding strategical expertise region, expatriates will become essential by representing the true high culture of the Pacific. In Apeli Haupa's proposed vision, the expansion of islanders to other continents inflates the community's reception, liberation from their neo-colonial past, and effective regionalization where Oceania is bound together by new forms of transportation, information, technology, and telecommunications. In both scenarios, diaspora play a crucial role in providing the South Pacific with independency, consistency, and continuity. According to migration, remittances, aid, and bureaucracy theory, the connection between islanders and their expatriates in the future will strengthen due to the increase of access to technology. Anthony Van Vossen illustrates forecasts the successful reception of 20% voice telecommunications indicates 2032 for Vanuatu and 2175 for Samoa. On the other hand, Oceanians predict an increase of culture transmitted by Pacific media, intercultural news exchange, and finally, creating new bonding with geographically similar areas such as the Caribbean. At the same time, the role of the internet remains crucial, as Pacific Islanders will look forward to shape its development. Dependency theory accents the continuous meaning and influence of Western media, what would indicate the growth of the importance of social media platforms in Oceania. In interview Owning Your Narrative, Christina Foa, Samoan author brought up in Sydney by her immigrants' parents, discusses the concepts and ideas inherited as a part of diasporic community. She accentuates the gender equality she experiences from South Pacific men she encounters and works with in Australia. I began to proudly say that I am a woman of color. I had to relearn that I stood with the men of my community and not behind them as Western society thought the Pacifica people were all. On Western South Pacific Islands, the reasons which sharing one's testimony and making self-disclosure a delicate matter constitute the closeness of relationship between people. Although the cultural context in collective structures threatens the nation's integrity and self-image, digital activism through social platforms gradually increased in power. Consequently, the diffusion of Metoo as a movement migrating internationally through the and online platforms depends on multiple factors which are yet to be investigated. And here are some works cited in my presentation. and some other resources. Thank you for all of your attention, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I would be looking forward to your feedback and any questions you might have.
Thank you, Agnieszka. The Samoans in the room, can you correct me? You now have a Samoan women prime minister, right?
Yes, we've got a woman prime minister after the elections in April this year.
I wonder how that might be changing the dynamic. Yeah, interesting notions there that you raised about a Western digital activism and feminism, and how that might be having an impact on the island's activism in terms of violence against women through their diaspora. I would be very interested to hear what the participants here have to say, especially those who are from Samoa, and whether they can relate to some of the things that have been raised by Agnieszka.
Can I go first? Yeah, just listening to your presentation, Agnieszka. That, you know, I thought it was really good in the sense that you had consulted, you know, different sources and had reached out. But I suppose it's not well, it could be a concern, but, you know, sometimes that when we research from an outside, not within the local, I suppose, context, sometimes there are things that, like what's been talked about in terms of the influence of the media, in terms of information, and also the chances of disinformation. There is that chance that some information may not necessarily carry a whole lot of truth behind it, but there is context still. But I'm not discrediting any of the sources that you've referred to and cited. I know that Marian and Yuki will also contribute to the discussion, but I just wanted to say that the notion of feminism, in my perspective, and this is my personal perspective, I've come to only just recently appreciate feminism in the sense that it's more than just, my understanding was very limited to the militarist notion of feminism, of activism, whereas recently I'm currently doing part of the Pacific Research Colloquium through ANU, and just this week we learned about inclusive research methodologies and how feminism and Pacific research methodologies are all part of that overarching branch of research. And so therefore it's presenting feminism in a way that I had not appreciated or understood it to be before. But in terms of the information, I know that there's quite a lot of shocking realities, I suppose, confronting realities that, listening to your presentation today, I'm also questioning some of the stuff. But yeah, just wanting to, to I suppose put out, to be cautious, because, in the Samoa, we're also bound by some things that make it, I don't know what the word is, but yeah, just so there's also, like, with the information in terms of where one person stands, in the case of our former Prime Minister and all those publications that you had showed in your presentation. Also, it doesn't necessarily represent the majority perspective on an issue, and so there's also that context. Yeah, but I know there's a lot of work being done as well in terms of that space, especially with the current movement around, the Stop Violence Against Women movement that's happening in Samoa with an actual structure and organization with that work going on. But I'll open the floor up to Yuki and Marian to maybe add to the conversation.
I'll just quickly jump in. Thank you. I'm just sorry in the beginning, it was really hard to hear, but I kind of got the gist of it. And I think the thing that comes to mind again is the, in terms of what Daisy is saying, I think that's the purpose of challenge and through academia. I think the outside perspective maybe provides the perspective that perhaps those of us Pacific people who are pulled by the tensions of culture, and the VAR, exactly what you're saying, it's uncomfortable, and we can't say that these issues have not been brought up. I think what I like about the contrast, I love the contrast of the hashtag #MeToo when you're talking about a collective culture. Also, the work around mobile phones that I talked about, the individual addressability of the mobile phone as your direct access, which gives you agency. And I think building on Yuki's question to Melika around Western feminism, when she's talking about the I and we, so all those different notions of what does this mean? And I think when I talked about in my presentation of social presence, co-presence, these are mediated spaces that in the Western world, they're defined as these things because it gives you a sense that you have an audience, you have this community, but in reality, right, if you're a Samoan person with a mobile phone and you can go online and you can have this hybrid conversations and you feel empowered as a woman, but in reality, in your actual reality, you're not, you're still oppressed. So does that make it wrong? I think that, and I like that contrast, right? The other thing was, I think there's a lot of other, as Valia talked about, Heather Horse work around mobile phones. Wallace talks about the immobile communication, that you're immobile, but you can still communicate. So all those different things where, for women who are feel trapped, or people who feel trapped, there's that outlet. And otherwise, where else would they go? And going back to my comment of Sandra and Vela, when Vela goes, when Sandra goes, you don't hit people, our culture, we don't hit people. But the decision to show that that actually happens in the reality of what could happen, and we talk about gender violence and so many other things, these taboo topics, they actually do exist. And I think it's the purpose of what we do, what we write about, what we put out there in film is to perhaps be the disruptor, to be the voice.
And Yuki, you wanted to say something?
Okay, so the problem with me about the Me Too movement is that it's actually based around the experience of cisgender women, right? It revolves around the experience of cisgender women that is based on a man-woman binary division framework that doesn't necessarily apply to Indigenous community, particularly in a place like the Moana Pacific. Yeah. So when we think about Ipeliha Ofa's essay about our Sea of Islands, and then he talks about how European and American continental men coming into the Moana, drawing up all of these lines that now forms the economic zone. To establish this binary from one place to the other, right? I would like to extend that notion to to how we understand now the idea about gender and sexuality through the Western binary framework, because when we look at pre-colonial ways of looking at the world, right? Gender and sexuality for me is not a black and white binary, right? When we look through the lens of Indigenous Oceania, because gender and sexuality in the Pacific is circular with many shades of gray. And then they are all tied together by the VA, right? So what's really interesting about when the Me Too movement comes into Moana communities, and there are those that sort of take advantage of the Me Too movement, to have a voice within this global network of cisgendered, womanist centered movements. But many people turn around and say, Yuki, you're one of us anyway. So Yuki, I just use the Me Too movement to get my message across. But once I shut off the cell phone, Yuki, I'm not one of them, because you're one of me.
Yeah.
And then that's been my experience, actually. Being in the Samoan community. So I feel like many cisgendered Samoan people always kind of have to navigate this. They have to navigate, because when you say navigate the Western culture, but it's not just, navigating the system, it's actually navigating the Western feminism, and navigating the Western cisgenderism and heterosexist, heteronormative dominance, over, indigenous, VA-centered understanding of gender and sexuality. I hope I made sense.
Well, you did, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, are you familiar with the Island Feminisms project? This is Professor Marina Caridis from Hawaii is actually leading this project. And they've had a research symposium, and it's online. You can find some of the material. It might provide you with a different alternative away from the island's perspective, feminisms, just to enrich the conversation.
Yeah.
And then there's a really good, and then look into the scholarship of Teresia Teaiwa.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and how she talks about militarism. And then how, the islands are feminized and then viewed through the lens of Gauguin, and how that kind of permeates into visual culture and tourism, and all of that.
I think read the article on Fiji women soldiers, but I will also look for this on tourism. Yes, thank you for all your feedback, and I totally understand it. So that's why I thought that at the beginning I was trying to refer to call in and call out culture, because for me, I think that personally I am like nowhere, because I come from post-communist country, so I'm like like somewhere in between, I guess. Like I can't refer like personally to anywhere but to Eastern like Europe, and but call in and call out culture is a good example, I think, how people approach the problems, whether they are direct with confrontation, or what kind of outcome would they like to have, right? Whether they want it to be more constructive, or whether it's just like accusing someone, as in Balance ton porc in France. So, and here I noted down as well that, and gender and sexuality is also interesting for me, because I know, for example, that in Samoa there is fa'afafine. So as you said, that there are multiple colors of gray, right? Like it's never black and white. So
yes, and in adding to that, so I am a fa'afafine. So I am, assigned male at birth, and I live my gender as a woman. And then so I co-edited a book entitled Samoan Queer Lives. Samoan Queer Lives, together with Samoan American artist and writer Dan Taulalapa McMullen. And then you'll find what I call feminism, aspects of feminism in this book, because the book is, it features 14 chapters, and each chapter is written by the members of the Samoa Fa'afafine LGBTIQ community in Samoa, American Samoa, and across the diaspora in Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and in Turtle Island, USA. And then you'll find other kinds of indigenous feminisms there.
I will definitely read it. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for the rich feedback to Agnieszka. I hope that this was really useful for you. Feedback.